Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much for joining us. My name is Trevor White and I am the director of the Little Museum of Dublin. And it is my pleasure to be hosting this evening's edition of Santa Rita, 120 Dublin Stories, with the Little Museum of Dublin and Santa Rita Wines. Our guests this evening are two pioneers around animal and food history in Ireland, and I will start by introducing them. Corey, good evening, Corey. Corey Wrenn is an American sociologist. She specializes in human-animal studies, the sociology of the animal rights movement, ecofeminism, and vegan studies. And Corey is the author of a super new book called Animals in Irish Society, which is published by the State University of New York Press, and she's now very kindly showing it off to you. It is going to be published in the coming months, I think, Corey, or is it published, or is it published, or is it the book already available?
I think it's out just this month.
Great, great, great. Well, I have had the pleasure of reading it over the last few weeks, as indeed has our other guest, Dr. Máirtín Mac Con Iomaire. Have I done justice to your surname, Máirtín?
Máirtín Mac Con Iomaire. There you go.
Yeah, okay.
Not too bad.
Máirtín is a lecturer in Culinary Arts in the Dublin Institute of Technology. He is well known as an award-winning chef, as a culinary historian, as a food writer, as a broadcaster, and indeed as a ballad singer. So you're very, very welcome this evening, Máirtín.
Might even break into song later on, you know.
You're very welcome to, very welcome. So as I said, our subject this evening is history of animals in Ireland. And I suppose my own interest in this subject was prompted by a conversation that I had on this podcast, on this web show, with Professor Juliana Adel about her own excellent book, Civilized by Beasts, which tells the story of the 19th century city and urban change, but really through the context of human-animal relationships. And I suppose in preparation for that conversation, I read Juliana's book, and I really got absolutely obsessed with this subject. I just think it's such a fascinating prism through which to view the history of our societies. And it was Juliana's work that led me to Corey and Corey's new book and to this evening's conversation. And I wonder, Corey, maybe just to start, whether you might just explain to us in very simple terms what animal history means, please.
So I guess animal history is a reimagining or a recognition of our own story. We are, of course, animals, and we have co-evolved with other animals, and animals are deeply ingrained in our society. But because they're so objectified, so exploited, so low on the hierarchy, we don't necessarily recognize their existence or the things that they've gone through, the experiences that they have had, and how it matters in their own right, but also how that history impacts our own society, our own history, our own present time as well. So it's just it's a recognition that non-human animals matter themselves, but they also play a very, very important role in the shaping of our own society, human society.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I know we're going to delve a little bit deeper into that and unpack and have a look at some of your own influences a little bit later on. But thank you very much just for that, setting the scene, as it were. And maybe, Máirtín, you'd start by telling us a little bit about your own background and your own, I suppose, your own the premise for your own interest in the history of food in Ireland, please.
Yeah, I suppose I was always interested in history, and I was always interested in food. And I suppose when I finished the Leaving Cert, I think it was 1986, I was offered two choices. You know, I was offered a cert course to become a professional chef in Cahill Brew Street, and I was also offered First Arts in UCD. And I ended up doing First Arts in UCD and studying history and modern Irish and economics for a year, and then gone, I suppose, rambling for a few years in the University of Life and traveling and working and all that sort of stuff before coming back and finally doing the chef's program in Cahill Brew Street. I did, a PhD in 2008 which are finished in 2008, which was sort of an oral history, and it was an oral history of Dublin restaurants. And basically I spoke to the old chefs and waiters and restaurateurs, and then got into archives and stuff like that. And that was very much inspired by my father, in that my father was sort of a folklorist. He was very into collecting sort of songs and stories, and always had a tape recorder. And from him, I understood the value of listening to old people, particularly, and that their stories. But in the year 2000, I got to attend the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery for the first time, and that really opened my whole sort of culinary history education. And really, for the over 20 years now, it's been sort of like a finishing school, you could say, you know what I mean, for me. And the way the Oxford Symposium works is that they have a theme every year. So it could be milk one year, or nurture another year, or wild foods another year, etc. So from around 2002, I took it on me to try and take whatever theme was going, to inspire me, to drive me, to force me to get a piece of work done, a bit of research done. So I ended up doing some work on the potato, or on seafood, or on eggs, or on corned beef, or things like that in Irish history, depending on whatever theme was happening. You know what I mean? So that's really what got me on the road, and I suppose I've kept going ever since. And over the years, then, like we started in 2012, we started our own Dublin Gastronomy Symposium. The best decision there was to make it a biannual event, so I can come up for air every other year. And then I started supervising a number of master's students and PhD students who have gone on to do wonderful things. So it's great to be learning from them, which is I'm sure Corey is at the same situation, where you get to guide and to mentor students, and you learn so much along the way.
Okay, great, thank you. I want to return specifically to the restaurants of Dublin a little bit.
Well, you have history there yourself, you know what I mean? Yeah, whites on the green, yeah.
But Corey, just to go back to you then, you've written this. I mean, it is a fantastically interesting history of animals in Irish society, but you have a particular slant, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I suppose just very broadly, it's a kind of an eco-feminist, Marxist kind of history of relationships between humans and non-human animals, as you describe them. Do you want to unpack that a little bit, maybe, and tell us a little bit about some of your own animating principles, please?
All right. Okay. Yeah. So ecofeminism has been around since, I'd say, the 70s. Maybe even earlier, but vegan studies, vegan sociology, this is really hot off the press kind of stuff. There is a recent turn in our field, and we can also call it critical animal studies, which is a little bit more encompassing. There's a recent turn in the field where we're now starting to recognize not just intersections of species and sex or gender, but also intersections with race, with ethnicity, and really, more importantly, especially in the context of this book, the role of colonialism. And yeah, there's a lot going on in this. I'm trying to not go too complex and jargony on you guys, but basically the argument, if we're coming at this from a Marxist perspective, Karl Marx always argued that our material conditions, that is the stuff around us, our economic mode of production, will dictate our culture, will dictate our beliefs and our behaviors. So if we're looking at the case of Ireland always having been a cattle-based society, well, yeah, that's why you would have animals being such a major part of the social system. But what I'm arguing in this book is that it's not always been so extreme as it is today. Of course, now Ireland is one of the biggest producers of animal products in the world, exceeding greenhouse gas emission limits that the EU is setting. This is a major issue right now for Ireland. So what I'm going back to is this imposition of various outsider sort of systems over the centuries, but more specifically when colonialism hit, with British colonialism, and you see they take what was a cattle-based society, but people are eating a lot more vegetarian because animal products are expensive. With the incoming of colonialism, then Ireland was basically turned into an external feedlot to feed the British colonial system. And so that's when you start to see this intersection of extreme human oppression, and of course also animal oppression, because now more and more animals are being killed in more extreme ways. So that's basically the argument that we're bringing in Marxism, where Marx is asking us to consider our economic mode of production and how that influences the structure of our society. But then the vegan feminist bit, it comes in, or you want to call it eco-feminist. That's asking us to explicitly recognize that there is almost a gendered relationship there, where you have animals and marginalized groups becoming feminized, lesser than, lower in the hierarchy. And more importantly, when we're talking about colonialism, is this notion of civilization. Because what were the Irish always referred to as those barbaric people out there over there, the heathens that need to be civilized. And in fact, with colonialization comes this concept of the human. This notion of what it means to be human is suddenly to be civilized, to be above animals, and to be, you know, it's really code for white British male, right? So women, people of color, Irish subjects have always been feminized and otherized and animalized. So that's what vegan feminism does. It tries to recognize those intersections. So hopefully that was that's fun stuff, isn't it?
As I say, I find it absolutely fascinating, but I have to admit, perhaps a function of who I am, you know, as a kind of a middle-aged, pale, stale male, that I also found it quite bracing to read the book, because it definitely does question a lot of the assumptions that, I suppose, in our unthinking way, we have about animals. So, for example, you mentioned colonialism there. Even to begin to look at Dublin Zoo, for example, an institution that's so you know, that's much loved in the popular memory here in Dublin, even to look at Dublin Zoo critically, you start to recognize that it is inarguable that Dublin Zoo has effectively been a tool for promoting an imperialist ideology for 200 years, or nearly 200 years. And it might well remain a much loved cultural institution in the city, but nonetheless, those are its origins. And that is I mean, to my mind, it seems unquestionable. You certainly make the case that it is really a handmaiden of empire. So as I say, it's kind of bracing to start thinking about these subjects, to start looking at them through a slightly different prism. Máirtín, I wonder whether you had a similar experience in terms of reading Corey's book, just around that.
No, no, absolutely. I'm equally pale, stale, and male. You know what I mean. So, and also, like, as I say, a meat eater and a milk lover. You know, but it's what I loved about Corey's books. I loved, like, that sort of bracing framing as such forces you to actually relook at things, you know. And like, I know that last year I completed, Dr. Mary Farrell finished her sort of PhD on looking at sort of gender inequality in Irish kitchens, you know. And ever since I started supervising Mary, suddenly my perspective on sort of gender inequality, you know, and the importance of noticing when you're organizing anything to make sure that there's at least equal representation. So suddenly you start seeing what's hidden in plain sight. So the same idea here with Corey's work is that you suddenly start looking, like you're looking there at the zoo and stuff like that, or you're looking, like it's really interesting, just the framing of language, for example. Like, I would say maybe, you know, roast beef, whereas Corey would be talking about the scorched flesh of a bovine or something like that. You know what I mean? Or, you know, so it's you know, I would be talking about, you know, maybe, you know, a cow being slaughtered. You know what I mean? Or you know, we use euphemisms as such, you know, that suddenly with this sort of feminist, vegan, you know, Marxist feminist, vegan phrasing and framing, you know, you shouldn't, there's no hiding from what's going on. Like, you talk about hair being plucked out of the sheep or whatever, you know, this sort of stuff. Like, it's very in your face, and it's very different. And, you know, suddenly you're taken aback a bit first until you then get into it, and it's interesting. You know, it's I think it's really important, because it's really important to look at things from other perspectives. And from anyone who's ever read the book, you know, Don't Think of an Elephant, like, you know, that whole idea about framing and how arguments are framed, and how people can steal arguments and win, you know, debates because of actually the framing of arguments. It's really interesting, you know what I mean? So I think we have been, as they say, the whole colonialism that Corey speaks about, like we're subjects of colonialism, we're subjects of, you know, centuries of this mindset, you know, and it's only now that we're only gradually getting around to actually, you know, trying to, from a feminist perspective, just to actually give equal rights and to see it as normal, and to see, you know what I mean, and even at that, there's such ingrained sort of you know, just that inequality within the system and within how we've been brought up, in how boys and girls are you know, play and toys that they're given and all that sort of stuff. Do you know what I mean? So you suddenly turn that on animals, and it really helps to sort of shape your mind and open your mind to a different way of looking at life. Yeah.
Thank you. And I agree completely with that critique, Máirtín. I want you to take us back, Corey, to the kind of the pre-colonial Ireland, if we may. And I realize that there's an element of speculation around some of this work, but just tell us a little bit about the relationship between animals and between humans and what I'm going to call, for the purpose of this conversation, animals as opposed to non-human animals, please.
Yeah, so I think very famously in Ireland, it used to have that very animistic sort of society or social system. And in an animistic social system, non-human animals are seen as other, but not necessarily so other. It's like today they're so otherized, we see them as properties, literal objects. We don't even think about their experiences in a lot of ways. But in an animistic culture, they're seen as community members. So many old Irish stories feature non-human animals as key players, not just as things in the story, but key players, actors. And in many ways, or in many cases, you would have humans who could transfigure into animals, and sometimes the reverse. So they were really seen as part of that society. This is also a time, this is going back to the Marxist argument, where it was a cattle-based society where people weren't really eating a lot of meat. They had the cattle, they were more profitable alive, so you could continue to milk them. There was some hunting that did take place, but not on the level. There's archaeological research that's now coming out that's saying that actually we have this kind of fantasy that Ireland has always been this heavy meat eating society, but the research is not necessarily supporting that anymore. And that tends to happen all across, you know, any kind of historical project where we project what we're currently living in onto the past. You know, thousands of years ago, we lived in a much different climate, we had much different economic systems. Our relationship with other animals was much more harmonious, a lot more egalitarian. So then what I'm also arguing is that, okay, I'm not saying that people didn't eat meat, of course they did, but not to the level they are today. But also there's this rich variety of indigenous foods that Irish people were eating that have been completely lost to history now. And I have to tell this like very quick little thing. What the reason what sparked me, I remember still to this day, I was sitting in a pub in America, was getting ready to go to Ireland. And the guy knew, the bartender knew I was vegan. And he says, what are you going to do in Ireland? All I do is eat meat and potatoes. I said, what? And I knew, because my partner at the time was vegan and knew all this vegan stuff that was in Ireland. And it's like, that this has been lost to the popular imagination, this rich variety of foods that have been there. And now we think of veganism as something that's alien and outsider, some product of globalization. But in fact, Ireland had this rich history all along. So this is something that you see sort of gradually eroding away until, ironically, then you enter the era of the 1700s and the 1800s under extreme British colonial oppression, where people are now vegetarian because they have to be. It's a vegetarianism of paucity, of suffering. And so I think that's kind of the legacy now when, and Ireland is becoming a vegan hotspot. Just in 2019, TripAdvisor named Dublin the most vegan friendly city in the world. So this is coming, it's happening in Ireland right now. And people might see it as something not Irish and outside, but in fact, it's been around for a long time in different forms with different philosophies. I think because of this legacy of the famine times and British colonial oppression and people really suffering because of this forced vegetarianism, you know, not a nutritionally valid diet. I think that's why people are a little standoffish to it.
That's, I mean, again, it's just extraordinary. It's almost blasphemous to hear you talking about Irish food culture in these terms, because we have been, we have been force-fed this ideology, which is all about privileging the interests of agribusiness, really, isn't it? I mean, that's ultimately what it's about. And we've convinced ourselves that we are, as your friend observed, that it's meat and veg, and that's the Irish way. But in fact, the reality, as you say, seems to be rather different. Tell me, you alluded to a food stuff that the Irish were eating a moment ago, Corey, that the kind of things that we ate in the diet that would be unfamiliar to modern ears. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? Or maybe Máirtín, you might want to.
Yeah, I mean, it's all sorts of stuff, I think Máirtín is the expert here.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I did I remember I did a paper. I'm interested in sort of place names, and I went looking at food-related place names. And what was fascinating about food-related place names is that suddenly you realize the wealth of all sorts of food, but so much vegetarian food and vegan food, that was eaten by our ancestors. Like, for example, just crav, right? Crav is the Irish for wild garlic. Or sort of ramsons, right? The amount of places named after crav, it ends up being craff, or craw in the anglicization of it. See, this the problem is that, so much our language, quite often, so many of the place names, they make no sense at all in how they've been anglicized. And you only have to look at Brian Friel's great play translations to get a sense of that. But like the whole idea about sorrel, wild garlic, charlock, all, just there's so much wild foods, bilberries, you know what I mean? There, even I went through all the poetry as well, and the songs and ballads and all of that sort of stuff. They're just full of they're just full of not necessarily vegan as well, because like one of the big things that our ancestors were big on, like they were huge on cattle, but they were huge on cattle for their milk and for their dairy product as such. So they called them the bon via, as in the white meats. So there's a great 13th century sort of satirical sort of story called Aisling Mac Con Iomaire, which sort of tells about this monk from Cavan, I think. He makes his way down, or from Manor or something, makes his way down to Cork, and he's treated very badly in Cork anyway by the monks there, and he satirizes them. But the king of Munster is dying from a demon of gluttony, and in this dream he dreams of a land of milk and honey, where he's sort of going across a lake of new milk in a coracle made out of lard, and he arrives at a stately home, and that there's butter palisades, there's sausages tying up the door, like everything is in there, like it's amazing, you know what I mean? But he speaks about the different types of milk, like there's milk of long chewing, milk of medium chewing, milk of all this sort of stuff, yellow bubbling milk and all that sort of stuff. And even with the place names, like it came across, like there's the idea about even when a cow does calve, the first colostrum that comes out, you know what I mean? In in Irish there's a name for that. There's two different names, like there's a first milk that comes out, and then there's a next milk that comes out, and all that sort of stuff, which is really rich, and we have place names named after it. So like just we have such, without talking about all the nuts and all the fruit and all the rest of it, you know what I mean, and the various seaweeds and the rest of it. So like just there's a huge wealth of plant-based knowledge and foraging and all this, and fermented foods as well. Like there's a thing called it's called sowens, right? And it's like basically it's the oat husks. It's the husks of the oats that are just soaked in water and left for around 10 days, and they ferment, and then that's strained off and can be sort of used sort of nearly like a vegetarian milk sort of thing, or like a vegan milk, or it could equally be sort of thickened up and made into a sort of a blancmange, So like just it's as Corey so well knows, when you study history, you realize that, life is just one cycle going around and round and around. Do you know what I mean? And our ancestors have learned and done all the things that we suddenly think are great now. You know what I mean? Almond milk, oat milk, all these things we think, oh, they're so hip and trendy. You know what I mean? And, they've been there for centuries. They've been there, and come and gone and all that sort of stuff. So it's fascinating.
Thank you. Corey, you have an interesting definition of veganism because it's sort of slightly different to the one that many people would be kind of familiar with. Can you tell us a little bit about that? How it sort of it encompasses a broader, I suppose, perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's your basic veganism, which basically means I don't eat any animal products. I don't consume any animal products. But for some people who are just going vegan for the dietary lifestyle, that they may continue to wear animal skin on their shoes or things like that. Coming from my field, and not just my field, but me as an activist, as a person, an individual, veganism means to me so much more. It's a political position. It's a political ethic. It's much more than just what I put in my mouth or don't put in my mouth. It's about what I wear, what I consume, how I interact, and how I understand other animals. So it's certainly it's a bigger political ethic, not just a diet. Yeah.
Yeah. In the introduction to the book, I'm just going to read a couple of lines you write, Corey. This is an alternate story of Ireland, one that centers its largest demographic, non-human animals, and their contribution to the country's development. This is not just a telling of non-human experiences, but critically how those experiences have also shaped that of humans and how other ideas how ideas about other animals influence Irish culture. I wonder, could you give us, again, we'll keep it relatively simple if we may, a couple of examples of how those experiences of non-human animals have shaped that of humans within Irish history, please.
Oh, geez. Well, I think I try to cover a lot of ground in this book, but I think that the main interest for me is the animal agricultural system. And I think I teach this when I teach race and ethnicity to my students. It's this notion that Irish people today are stereotyped, at least in America, where I'm from, as being very white, being very pale. And I say this as a very pale, freckly person myself, but that's a stereotype. But in the 1800s, probably earlier than that, but when you have this colonial system coming into place, which is based on the exploitation of animals, which is based on the mass production of meat, dairy, and other animal products, you start to see this deep animalization of Irish people. So when you see these old caricatures from American magazines and Victorian England magazines, where you see Irish people depicted as apes and monkeys, this comes out of that. So the argument here is that by building a system, a social system on the exploitation of animals, you're creating a framework that can be applied on other marginalized groups. So this notion that Irish people were not even seen as white, of course, race is a social construction, but they were literally seen as having physically dark skin. Literally I've seen one reference where they were thought to be the missing link between apes and humans. And that can't just come from anywhere. That comes from this colonial system that's been put in place, this logic of these groups are analyzed, other, less than civilized, and therefore it's okay for us to exploit and use them. So animals themselves are animalized, right? They're just other beings that live in our society. But we've constructed what it means to be animal. What are these things that mean to be animal? We put those on all different species, including human species of different kinds. So that's the main one that I like to go to. I mean, that's the crux of it all. That what the history of Ireland, what has happened, and it's this animalization that's kind of propelled.
Yeah, and again, I want to understand this, but I forgive my own limited intelligence. But I really want to understand this. So what we're basically saying, in very simple terms, is that by othering animals, we're able then to other the Irish people in service of a colonial project, basically. Is that I mean, I don't want to misrepresent your view, but I just find it fascinating. It's basically that we're othering. First of all, we're othering animals, and we're doing that as a kind of that's a very convenient way of diminishing their rights, but we're also othering human beings. Is that
right? Yeah, and Ireland's not the only place where this has happened. I wrote this book about Ireland because I had a special interest that there was nothing written about it at the time, but it's happened in colonies in Africa and India and the United States. It's been done to African American, Black folks. It's across the board. If you see a group of marginalized humans in any way I can guarantee you that there's animalization taking place there. So yeah, the argument here then with vegan feminism is that we need to start disrupting this notion of animals as other and lesser than, because as long as we protect that and don't critique it and not thinking about that, it can be used and applied to other human groups across the board. You see it set time and time again, marginalized people being described in animal-like terms, and sometimes literally being seen as non-human animals.
I think it's interesting from a food perspective how food is used quite frequently to, draw people, to make people seem strange. Do you know what I mean? So the idea is, I think Corey's written about this, about the idea about the British being beef eaters,
right.
So even this idea about beef eaters, even how it got its term, like, but the beef eaters originally were they were the guards of sort of Henry VIII's palace. And actually that was a great sort of, it really was a sleight of hand, because as the ambassadors would come from around Europe, they'd be so impressed by his big castles and the fact that he fed his soldiers beef. He says, Jesus, you don't go to war with this fella, he's so wealthy, he's feeding them beef, you know what I mean? Whereas actually Henry VIII he was calling their bluff, because if they had gone to war with him, he didn't have enough money to actually properly go to war with them, sort of thing, But this idea about beef eaters, whereas then the Irish were just known as potato heads or potato eaters, you know what I mean? Or the Indians as rice eaters, or the French then, as frogs as such, you know what I mean? And this sort of stuff. So it's really interesting, that idea, as you say, the otherization, of the belittling, or the whole idea about, because I remember from the oral history I did with chefs, who had worked in London or worked on the Queen Mary or on some of the Cunard lines with English chefs, and they'd get this whole idea, oh yeah, Paddy, do you still have the pigs in the parlor and all this sort of stuff, and Corey in our book speaks about this, about like in the Irish in New York or in America and places like that, and same at home. Like the idea is that you used to bring the animals in, and part of keeping the animals in was to protect them and keep them warm, but also to warm the house. Do you know what I mean? And so there was a logic to it. You know what I mean? And the pig was known as the gentleman who paid the rent, and there was great respect for the animals and all this sort of stuff. And they lived, as I say, much closer and much sort of interaction and just nearly as a family sort of thing with the animals. Do you know what I mean? But then that is belittled by this idea about pigs in the parlor, or belittled about all of that sort of ways of thinking. You know what I mean? So again, it's down to framing, and it's about sort of the dominant part of society, the colonialist mindset, belittling and sort of otherizing who they're dominating.
Yeah, and I think the ironic part then is, after colonialism ends, what ultimately happens in all these post-colonial spaces is that they've been so downtrodden and so belittled for their vegetarian diets, whether they were intentional indigenous and vegetarian diets or forced through the colonial system when they were going without. You see over and over again a kind of doubling down on that once they become independent. So India was really, really diminished because of that, the rice eater sort of nonsense. And so now, after they became independent, the government put tons and tons of resources into dairy production and other things. And so now India, I think, is the biggest dairy producer in the world. And you see that with Ireland as well. Ireland could have gone two different ways. And we can talk about this towards the end. I know that, Trevor, you wanted to ask about the nationalist bit there, but it could have gone two different ways. Just like in many countries in Europe, when all this upheaval happened, there was really radical people who had a different vision, who recognized that Ireland's oppression was so predicated on this animal agriculture that was taking over the whole country, using up the resources, kicking people off the land, causing a lot of hunger. But then there were people who said, yeah, but this is how we play in the world system, and this is what our oppressors once did, and we don't want to double down on this vegetarian nonsense when we can become world powers as well. And ultimately, that's the route Ireland went, was let's go the animal agricultural route, because historically, that's how you get esteem and wealth, is through the exploitation of other animals, even though it has a really negative effect on climate change and people's health and non-human animals.
I would encourage people watching to write questions in the chat, please, if you have any questions. We've an interesting comment from Roger. Says, I love Donald Watson. Donald Watson, the best known co-founder of the vegan social movement in 1944. I love Donald Watson's thoughts on veganism from 1945. He said it was about opposing the exploitation of sentient beings whether it is profitable to do so or not. Very wry observation on the practice of eating meat really as much as anything else. Okay, good. Yeah, I want to go on to that, if I may, Corey. You referenced it there a moment ago, the whole veganism and vegetarianism in the context of cultural nationalism in the early years of the 20th century here in Ireland, and specifically in Dublin. In fact, the Dublin, as you know, had the Sunshine Vegetarian Dining Rooms operated by the Dublin Vegetarian Society on Grafton Street in 1891. And there was the College Vegetarian Restaurant, which opened at about the same time, touting, as you say in the book, the digestible, economical, and scientifically proven superiority of its pure diet of fruit and vegetables. It's lovely, that image really of the city as a hotbed, not simply of kind of political subterfuge, but also of curious cultural ideas. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that era, please?
So this is well known in animal studies, in the history of animal studies. People know that there's the vegetarian restaurants in London. It's where all the suffragettes hung out and all that sort of stuff. But I had not heard at all about this happening also in Dublin. And this is actually one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, is that in the great narrative of animal rights history, there's a hyper focus on the United States and Britain. And there's so much going on in the middle. And of course, Ireland has had such an impact on the world in so many different ways. But it was just astonishing to me that there was this amazing vegan and vegetarian kind of activism that was happening there. And these authors, people who were writing books in the 1830s and 40s, that was some of the first animal rights books ever written, some of the most influential activists in the entire movement from the 19th century were Irish or of Irish heritage. And it's completely, no one acknowledges this. And what's going on? So we celebrate the US and the UK, but what's going on in the middle here? All this amazing stuff is happening. So, and I think, again, this has a lot to do with the legacy of really just ethnocentrism, this idea that Ireland is this kind of colonial backwater sort of place, and not recognizing that, in fact, there was a lot of people who had a lot of really good ideas. There's a lot of debate. There's a lot of discourse. We've come out of this this oppression. We're going to create a new path for this country. Which way are we going to go? And there's a lot of people who recognize not just that animal agriculture had just like demolished the landscape and pushed so many people off their homes, but also recognizing that this kind of diet of paucity of British imports and like really processed stuff, they were worried about the health that was having like public health issues. But also, I don't want to diminish non-human animals. It's not just about humans, right? They also had an experience here. So people were also recognizing non-human animal rights and were worried about their experiences, non-human animals. So yeah, there was a lot going on in these vegetarian restaurants. In fact, they were surveilled a lot of times for the. There was a lot of heady stuff happening over these tables. And the proclamation, this is what gets me, the proclamation was actually signed in a vegetarian restaurant. So you can't get any, it's like right there, it's amazing stuff.
That is extraordinary. Thank you.
I know, Trevor, like when I was carrying out my research on Dublin restaurants, like one of the big sort of surprises was to find these vegetarian restaurants, over 100 years ago. You know what I mean? That it wasn't what I was looking for, and suddenly you find them. And also to find, like, there was an Indian restaurant, I think it was 1909 or something like that, just next to the Gresham Hotel for around a year, and, then the next one thing shows up maybe around 1941 or something like that. But like the thing, and even I think the Hindustan, I think it was called the first Indian restaurant in London, the Indian chef or restaurateur was married to a woman from Cork. He'd originally been in Cork, you know what I mean? So like there's an Irish connection there as well, you know what I mean? So all of these things, like as you say about history, the more you go into it, you realize is that these things go around in circles, you know what I mean? And we think we're so new and so hip and so, you know, doing this for the first time. And sure, you know, as I say, go back to Pythagoras, go back to any, you know, go all the way back, you'll find these, you know, coming again and again and again, you know.
It is one of the sadnesses, of course, of modern Irish history, that this atmosphere that you both refer to here, this very tolerant, pluralist, eclectic kind of cultural environment, is basically sniffed out after independence. You know, that after independence we go back into our shell, having secured independence, and
well, as they say, the best and the brightest died quite often. You know, the guys who wrote the proclamation were the dreamers, were the poets, were the guys with the great ideas. You know what I mean? And you know, they were wiped out then. And then you know, the War of Independence, and then you have a civil war, and then so who's left? Do you know what I mean? But the the people who played it safe. You know what I mean? And then they do what do they do? They just replicate the colonial system. Do you know what I mean? And play it safe. You know, so like, you know, Arthur Griffith, like I know Corey speaks about sort of, you know, with non-human animals, you know, talking about fisheries as well, like that. But like, you know, Arthur Griffith was the only one, you know, of those sort of signatories of that generation who realized that Ireland as an island nation, you know, weren't even tapping into the resource that was in front of us, like just hidden in plain sight. And part of that was because of the idea about the cattle and stuff had been social. But also part of it is that from Tudor times, after the Battle of Kinsale, there was a rule brought in that no Irish person could own a boat over a certain size, because the fear was that actually, you know, the whole idea about Britannia ruling the waves, or waving the rules, whichever way you want to put it, you know what I mean? You know, that even when the Reformation came in, they held on to, Protestant England held on to the idea about fishing Fridays, and they held on to the idea of fishing Fridays to keep the fishing industry strong, because the reason to keep the fishing industry strong is to make sure that they had manpower for their navy whenever they went to war. You know, so these things are really interesting to look at them and to see, you know, all of the different sort of geopolitical and sort of subtle different things that were decisions that were taken at different times. And then even like with you know, I think saying to Corey, you know, reminded me about in Catholicism that, you know, for so much, you know, up until Vatican II, particularly, I suppose, you know, half the year we were basically eating a vegan diet based on what you were allowed to eat. And, you know, and people took that really, really seriously. Do you know what I mean? There was like, even up, and I was speaking to friends recently about, you know, people who remember suddenly, you know, having, you know, maybe their parents might have made them while they were starting working, you know what I mean? They might have made them a sandwich, and if there was ham in the sandwich, like the mother ringing in saying, oh, tell them there was ham, you know, in the sandwich, you know, and it's a Friday, you know what I mean? Or it was maybe on a Thursday night breaking into a Friday or something like that. And like, you know, this idea, like we've no idea, you know what I mean, how it was. And the idea about fasting and the idea about Lent, and how it wasn't just about not eating meat. It was they were staying away from butter and from dairy and from the whole lot. Do you know what I mean? So there was all of this idea about producing sort of bull's milk, you know what I mean, that would act as a substitute and all that sort of stuff. So, you know, it is, you know, Corey's absolutely correct. All through history, do you know what I mean? And I have to compliment her on the research she's done, because, like, you know, I've been 20 odd years sort of doing this sort of research, that and you know, she really has captured very accurately sort of from ancient times up to the present day. Do you know what I mean? And all the nuance of it, you know what I mean? But, you know, our ancestors, like they did eat meat, they did eat fish, they did it, but very little and very sparingly compared to what we're dealing with nowadays. As they say, nowadays, every day seems to be Christmas Day. Do you know what I mean? So.
Just in relation to your own research, Máirtín, around restaurants, I wonder, are there any kind of observations that you would make about the role that animals have in specifically in that culture, in the restaurant culture? is it, for example, that restaurants serve to buttress that self-image that the Irish have as a kind of or the Dublin has a cow town, for example, the preeminence of cattle, for example, within Irish culture? Do restaurants, in some sense, support that agenda, or is it?
I don't think restaurants necessarily support that agenda, because the idea about Cowtown was, based around there, the top of Stony Batter, you had, which is now Drumalee. It's a big housing estate, you know what I mean? But for generations and centuries, like, that was the cattle market, and the drovers used to drive the cattle in from Meath. And like, there's actually really rich history there as well, because even with Meath farmers and beef farmers, like the Brutons, for example, right, who are really rich, beef farmers in Meath, they also hold vast land in the Burren. And there's this tradition of actually wintering their cattle outside on the uplands in the Burren, because the Burren draws in heat from the sun on the limestone and then releases it gradually during the winter, which means that there's actually growth in the crevices and the grikes in the Burren, that feeds and maintains cattle over winter time. And then as they bring them back, they have found that within something like 3 or 4 weeks on good grass back in the thing, that their form and their meat and their muscles is perfect for sale. Do you know what I mean? And this has been going on. So all of these animals would have been walked in from Meath, but by the drovers. Then they would have been sold at the cattle market, and then a huge amount of them then would be actually marched down to the North Wall, down the North Circular Road, to be exported live. Others would have been then sent off to the different abattoirs that all over the city. There was loads of abattoirs, and so I don't think it necessarily fed into the restaurant business. Now, one of the very famous restaurants in Dublin, really rich restaurants, was Jamé's, but like, from speaking to, Christy Sands, who was a waiter there years ago, he spoke about like a really rich cattle dealer, who'd come in with shite on his boots. Do you know what I mean? But he was given a special table inside the door, because he'd wads of money. Like, he was so wealthy, you know what I mean? Now, and this idea, so they understood, between, like, there was at one level you had sort of the aristocracy coming there, and then you had sort of like the academics coming from Trinity College, and you had this, that, the other. But at the other level, you had these really wealthy cattle dealers, you know what I mean, as well, you know what I mean? And but the other side, the other link with the restaurants would have been the idea about the swill, because I remember, like, I remember working up in Blake's in the 1980s in Stillorgan, you know what I mean? And there was always the swill man would come, and like, as the, like, Blake's was, we used to, around 800 people a day or more, you know what I mean? Like, it was huge operation, and cleaning down the plates would go into a special bucket, and then that would shipped out to the back, and then the swill man would come and take it, and that would be fed to the pigs. And so the whole idea about we're always talking now about circular economy and, reduce, reuse, recycle. Like, life was all about, that was everyone's life, was reduce, reuse, recycle, you know what I mean, back in the day, sort of thing, before this old plastic industry. And they shut it down. So around 1987, European laws came in that swill would then have to be boiled before it was fed to the animals. And that shut down so many of the small little piggeries, because so many people, like bus drivers, used to keep pigs in Dalkey and Sallynoggin and places like that. You know what I mean? Ed Hick, the pork butchers from out there, was telling me about, like, that they used to just buy their pigs locally, butcher them locally, and they would served locally. And that was the same about every town in Ireland and every small village and all that sort of stuff, that food was produced locally, it was killed locally, and it was consumed locally. And then with this industrialization of the business, suddenly animals were being driven 100 miles and more in trucks to big factories. And then the idea about the bones, because even the thing about the bones is that the butcher, you used to go and used to ask, oh yeah, well, I'll have a bit of meat and some bones for the dog, or some soup bones. Do you know what I mean? So you'd bring the bones that would come from the animal, would go back to the people, would form stock for soup or for go to the dogs or whatever it was. But suddenly, when they were butchering all the meat, all those bones were left, what the hell do you do with them? We're not, we can't give, no one wants them anymore. They were ground into bone meal, fed back then into to cattle. So the idea the cattle then suddenly, you know, which were herbivores, suddenly became cannibals, you know, and we ended up at BSE, you know what I mean? So it's just greed, you know, and it's, you know, this idea about this grotesque sort of monster of agribusiness sort of thing, you know what I mean? And that's, I suppose, hopefully what we're trying to move towards. But you know, it you know, for all our hoping and talking, and quite often when we're speaking in sort of circle like-minded people, we're still only a very small minority of any global system. Do you know what I mean? So we have to be aware of that too.
I want to come to Corey on that, if I may. And first, I just to read a comment. Marvy Wheel writes, riveting knowledge, Dr. Wrenn. In Irish history, is there a correlation and or causation between gender inequality and animal-human-animal relations?
Well, I don't know about in the context of the local economy.
Yeah.
Which, you know, that's fair. I know locavorism is kind of the hot thing now, but for me, I'm obviously as a vegan activist and all that, like, you know, and the research also shows that is if vegan food, even if it's imported from elsewhere, is still less environmentally problematic than animal products.
Yeah.
But anyway, the gender bit, yeah, absolutely. For instance, I've seen one reference where back in the cattle driving days, because that's how that economy worked, is you couldn't just all sit together. You had to go and, you know, round up cattle and steal from other people, a bit of a war-based society. And oftentimes they would take women slaves, and in addition to stealing other people's cows. And there was kind of this association. And Máirtín might have more information on this, but also women historically were the ones who had to take care of the animals. So like livestock tenderers. and then with the more conservative marriage laws, and sometimes people would go, they would have the county fairs or the local town fairs, and you go in and you buy your livestock and you haggle for a woman. I don't know if that's unique to Ireland. I mean, that's kind of, you know, the story of women in a lot of places of the world, but I did see some of that in my research.
But I think there was actually liberation there as well for women because there was the whole idea about, like I mentioned there earlier on, about this idea about wintering on the uplands. You know, there was the whole tradition of transhumance. So the transhumance was sort of come the 1st of May, that the cattle would be moved up to the mountains, you know, so that actually the normal fields could actually, that they could grow sort of hay or grass and that sort of stuff, you know, or wheat or different things, you know what I mean, and that they could save that for the winter time sort of thing, where there was grass growing up in the mountains. And so they went up and we called it bullying, you know what I mean? So they have a small little house, and like when they say a house would be like a lean-to, a shed sort of thing, you know what I mean, made out of, you know, heather and stones and all this sort of stuff. But it was the girls would go up there, and they would milk the cows, and then they'd make the butter up there, and then maybe every week or something like that, maybe the boys might come up and bring the butter down, you know what I mean, to be sold and that sort of stuff. But equally they would have brought, you know, they would have done spinning and wool and that sort of stuff. But they had great, you know, there's some of their songs like, you know, Colleen's As Cruits in a Mo, and there's these different ballads about, you know, married women sort of dreaming of those days of sort of freedom that they had up on the mountains when they only had to look after themselves. And quite often there was sort of romances happening up there away from the village and all that sort of stuff as well. You know what I mean? So these things, and I know there's been some, recently there's been, I think lads from NUIG, I think, have written a number of books about sort of the history of transhumance and that experience and stuff like that, if anyone wants to look deeper into it.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
I want to just finish by bringing this conversation up to the present day, and actually to speculate a little bit about years to come. And Corey, I'd like you maybe just to give us a kind of a, I suppose, give us a wish list. Like when you write a book like this, it's quite clear that you have a kind of there's a fervor about it in every word, frankly, and it makes it all the more interesting to read. Like it's a super read. I congratulate you on the book, but you must have some sort of political agenda, and I say that as an endorsement. You know, I happen to be sympathetic to it, but I suppose, where would you like us to go as a society? Where would you like us to be in 15 or 20 years time?
Fully vegan, a vegan world, a liberated world. Yeah, but realistically though, my most basic goal with this book is just to ask people to see animals to recognize animals, to think about this, think against, maybe critique this stereotype that's been imposed on Ireland. In many ways, people have self-embraced that stereotype. To reimagine and remember, I think remember is the better word, remember this wealth of animal rights history, of vegan history, being sensitive to the complexity of Irish history, not just kind of washing it over. We always just ate meat and potatoes, which is not true. And the other point is, to be frank, veganism is coming. We can't stop it. It's on the way. We're coming for you. So instead of seeing veganism as some alien outsider thing, instead be thinking about veganism that is in some ways, not completely, right? We've talked about the complexities here, but in some ways it is indigenous. And so embracing that and recognizing how we can move forward in a world where climate change is only going to become more and more pressing, especially for Ireland, right? Ireland's always getting a slap on the wrist for all the climate change contributions it's giving. So it can't keep on the way it is. It can't keep on. So I'm only asking then for us to, think about veganism as something that might be a little bit more closer to home than outside somewhere. And really remembering and celebrating all the amazing Irish people who've done so many cool things over history that's been forgotten. And then of course, non-human animals who ultimately their experience, I think, is the most overlooked and the most important.
Thank you. That's very, very well put. Máirtín, same question to you, really. Where do you see this going? Because this is obviously, it's a conversation that we're only really starting to have as a society, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just the last thing Corey said there about, that these people who, amazing people who we're only starting to celebrate now. I recently listened back to a presentation, I think it's Kieran Carson gave, about sort of Dublin's link with slavery, you know what I mean? And, we pick and choose who we wish to remember and which story we wish to tell, and I think that's really interesting. Do you know what I mean? So and hopefully that's where we're going in the future, that hopefully, that we can, whether it's Shackleton or whether it's Concannon Wines or something like that, or out in California, whoever, that we can, or whether it's whoever, I forget his name, the wonderful athlete from Northern Ireland who was a vegan, you know what I mean, who one of the lovely things I remember from reading Corey's book there was that seemingly more people came to watch this amazing athlete swim across Galway Bay in 1963 then came to visit John F. Kennedy or something like that, which I thought was amazing, you know what I mean? So it's really interesting. But the idea about, I think one of the beginning things that Corey spoke is the fact that, Dublin and Ireland, suddenly the restaurants are known as some of the best vegan restaurants in the world. Chapter 1, for example, right, was voted, without ever trying to do this, were voted as sort of one of the best vegan restaurants in the world. Like, you know what I mean? Like, they're not a vegan restaurant, but they just they understand that a lot of their customers, are interested in either vegetarian or vegan food. And the same with places like Mr. Fox, a place like that. So they've actually, instead of just, what people had done in the past and, just doing the boring stuff, they've embraced it and they've used creativity, and suddenly then they get known as a really good vegan restaurant. And it's brilliant because then you can bring friends there who are vegan, and like, I'm not a vegan, I'm not a vegetarian, but you can bring them there and they're going to get a really good meal. And there's no, everyone's, because that's what hospitality is. Hospitality is making sure that everyone who comes, regardless of what their wishes are looked after warmly without any problems. Do you know what I mean? So I think we're going in the right direction there, you know what I mean? And long may it last.
Well, that's very well said again, and it's lovely to hear Chapter 1, Ross Lewis, being cited as a maverick in that regard, because or as a trailblazer, I suppose, rather than a maverick, because he is at the forefront of so many.
But just on that, Mark Moriarty, right, who won I think 2015, who won the San Pellegrino Young Chef of the World. Right, we spoke here about like beef and salmon, sort of thing as being sort of linked with Ireland. When he was picking a dish, he decided to go with a vegetarian dish. Right, he went with basically, it was a celeriac roasted celeriac, and he sort of made sort of like a miso sauce that sort of linked in with what you call it, Guinness, and he made sort of like a celeriac tea, which linked into the fact that we're tea drinkers, and he served it in his grandmother's teacup that you got for a wedding present in 1954. And so he had the other story of Ireland, you know, worked into his dish. And that's sort of cleverness, as opposed to just going with what is sort of known as traditional, whether it's beef or salmon and that. And hence, you know, he won the award. Do you know what I mean? He beat everyone, you know, so it's great.
That's very encouraging indeed. I got to give Corey one last question, because I'm mindful, Corey, we've lots of questions coming in for you and people clamoring to hear your views. Can you think of an example of any society which is currently veering towards veganism?
Yeah, I think that would have to be Israel. Israel has a really large vegan population, and a lot of, most importantly, the only way that veganism is going to go forward is with state support, and to start reducing subsidies that we give to big agriculture, basically, or big animal agriculture. There's issues with Israel, of course. Some people are arguing that this is just kind of greenwashing what's happening with Palestine. So that's why I hesitated a little bit. I would say for sure here in the UK, we're on the right path with that. I've only lived in the UK for about 2.5 years, and coming from the US, where I thought it was pretty vegan friendly, it's a whole other ball game here. It's a major part of the land, of the cityscape here where I live in Canterbury.
You're in Canterbury, yeah. Okay, brilliant. This has been a really enjoyable conversation. Thank you so much to Máirtín and to Corey for joining us this evening and for sharing your expertise, your anecdotes, your insights about a subject that is unfamiliar to a great many of the people who might normally watch this show. But I hope that you've found it provocative in a good way, playfully provocative, and indeed that you'll, I suppose, reflect on our relationship with animals within this culture, within this society. If nothing else comes of this conversation, I think that'll probably be a useful outcome. So thank you very much indeed. Corey, I wish you the best of success with your book. It's a brilliant book, and it's really timely, and I congratulate you. And thanks so much, Máirtín, as well, for joining us. Good night, everybody.